On a scorching afternoon in mid-September of 1943, the air shimmered above what had been Italian farmland just days before. Colonel Dietrich Peltz of the Luftwaffe found himself stationed temporarily at a headquarters position near Salerno, tasked with observing and documenting Allied operations. What he witnessed that day would shake the foundations of everything German military planners thought they understood about modern combat. His pencil moved rapidly across his notepad, but his hand trembled slightly as he recorded observations that contradicted decades of military doctrine. The numbers simply didn't make sense according to any framework he had been taught. 17 aircraft were currently operating from terrain that had been nothing but a wheat field the previous day. Through his binoculars, Peltz watched American transport planes landing and taking off with the casual efficiency of commercial airline operations, except this was happening on a runway constructed in impossible time frames. The gleaming steel matting caught the Italian sunlight as it stretched across ground that German engineering officers had personally assessed as unsuitable for aviation operations without extensive preparation lasting several months at minimum. Everything Peltz had learned at military academy, everything codified in Wehrmacht planning manuals, insisted that proper airfield construction demanded no less than 6 weeks under optimal conditions with zero enemy interference. Yet here, before his eyes, under continuous artillery bombardment and regular air attacks, American engineers had created a fully operational fighter base in less time than German units typically needed just to establish a functional field headquarters. The methodical approach German forces took to any construction project, the careful surveying and planning, the extensive preparation and quality control, all of it seemed rendered obsolete by what the Americans were accomplishing in mere hours. 27 German staff officers would eventually be captured during the subsequent Allied push through the Italian peninsula. During their interrogation, every single one expressed complete bewilderment at what they termed American military capabilities that defied logical explanation. None of these experienced officers, veterans of campaigns across Europe, had any framework for understanding what they had witnessed. They couldn't have known they were observing the opening moves of a systematic dismantling of German strategic assumptions about warfare itself, accomplished not through superior tactical doctrine or greater fighting spirit, but through an engineering revolution that made traditional military thinking completely obsolete. The fundamental mathematics governing air superiority were being rewritten, but the calculations had nothing to do with aircraft performance statistics or pilot kill ratios. Instead, construction timelines that German planners had considered physically impossible were becoming the new standard for military operations. This revelation had actually begun several days earlier when Allied forces came ashore at Salerno on the 9th of September. Among the first wave of landing craft were vehicles that German observers initially failed to properly identify or understand. General Rudolf Sickinius commanded the reconnaissance battalion of the 16th Panzer Division, and his report mentioned American trucks carrying what appeared to be perforated steel sheets, thousands upon thousands of them, stacked like oversized playing cards in the back of transport vehicles. His intelligence officers examined the reports and dismissed these materials as temporary road surfacing, perhaps intended for supply routes through the notoriously muddy Italian terrain that became impassable after autumn rains. None of them had any conception they were witnessing the deployment of pierced steel planking, the innovation that would fundamentally revolutionize how wars were fought. The material that would become known simply as PSP represented a transformation in military capability that German planners had never imagined possible. The genesis of this transformation traced back to an obscure location in North Carolina during November of 1941. Near the town of Marston, American engineers had accomplished something German planners categorically stated was impossible. They constructed a runway measuring 3,000 feet in length, capable of handling heavy bomber aircraft, in just 11 days from start to finish. The secret lay in the deceptively simple design of interlocking steel mats. Each individual section measured 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, weighing 66 pounds, perforated with 87 holes that reduced weight while maintaining structural strength sufficient to support aircraft weighing tens of thousands of pounds. German military attachés stationed in Washington had actually filed reports about these experiments, dutifully documenting American claims about revolutionary construction techniques. Those dispatches were dismissed in Berlin as American propaganda, another example of Yankee exaggeration and boastfulness designed to intimidate potential enemies through psychological warfare rather than genuine technical achievement. Captain Wilhelm Schultz served in the Wehrmacht's Engineering Corps and would later write extensive post-war analysis of American construction capabilities. In his assessment, he noted that German military culture believed Americans were fundamentally soft, that their society's obsession with comfort and convenience made them incapable of the harsh improvisations that warfare demanded. German soldiers prided themselves on their ability to endure hardship, to make do with minimal resources, to improvise solutions under the worst possible conditions. They assumed this cultural toughness gave them an inherent advantage over Americans who they believed had been pampered by modern conveniences. What German planners could never conceive was that this very trait, the American intolerance for discomfort and inconvenience, would drive them to engineer comfort directly into the battlefield itself. Rather than accepting hardship as inevitable, Americans treated it as an engineering problem to be solved through industrial innovation. The first documented German encounter with American runway construction capabilities actually occurred at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, though the Wehrmacht High Command wouldn't fully grasp its significance for more than another year. Japanese reports reaching Berlin through diplomatic channels in late 1942 described American engineers repairing bomb-cratered runways in hours rather than days. The reports seemed fantastical, describing capabilities that defied everything known about engineering timelines. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Supreme Command of the German Armed Forces, dismissed these accounts as Tokyo's desperate attempt to excuse their failure in the Solomon Islands campaign. General Alfred Jodl reportedly told his staff that the Japanese were seeing phantoms and inventing excuses to explain their defeats, that they were attributing supernatural capabilities to the Americans rather than accepting responsibility for their own tactical failures. But those phantoms were entirely real, as events would soon demonstrate. The 804th Engineer Aviation Battalion had landed with the Marines at Guadalcanal in August of 1942, inheriting a partially completed Japanese airstrip that was little more than cleared ground. Within days, despite nightly bombardment from Japanese warships and daily air raids that turned the field into a shooting gallery, they had transformed the facility into a base capable of supporting continuous combat operations. The Japanese, whose own engineering doctrine allocated weeks for such work and relied heavily on manual labor, watched in growing disbelief as American bulldozers, working around the clock in rotating shifts, accomplished in hours what their own labor gangs achieved in days of backbreaking work. The scale and efficiency of American engineering operations simply had no precedent in Japanese military experience. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Kleist was captured at Salerno while commanding an artillery battery. He spent hours interrogating his American captors about their engineering capabilities, unable to accept their matter-of-fact explanations as genuine. In letters to his wife that were discovered decades later in American military archives, he wrote that the Americans spoke of laying runways as one might describe spreading a tablecloth for dinner. They had mechanized what should have been impossible, treating extraordinary engineering feats as routine daily tasks. The casual attitude American engineers displayed toward accomplishments that would have been considered major projects by German standards disturbed von Kleist more than any combat experience had. It suggested a fundamental disparity in capabilities that went far beyond simple numerical superiority. The true shock for German commanders came when they began to understand the scale of American production capacity. Each steel mat required precise manufacturing to ensure perfect interlocking capability with adjacent sections. The hooks and slots cut into each piece had to maintain tolerances of less than 1/16 of an inch, precision engineering of the highest order. German industry, despite its well-deserved reputation for precision engineering and quality manufacturing, struggled to maintain such standards while producing a few thousand aircraft components monthly under wartime conditions. The Americans were producing 3 million square feet of PSP matting every single month by mid-1943, enough raw material to construct 10 complete heavy bomber bases. At the Carnegie Illinois Steel Company facility alone, 5 separate production lines ran continuously, 24 hours every day, 7 days every week without pause. Steel arrived from mills in Pennsylvania, was pressed into shape by machines exerting 2,000 tons of pressure, punched with holes in the carefully calculated pattern developed by Army Corps of Engineers specialists, and shipped to ports often before the paint had fully dried on the finished pieces. Workers later recalled that the factory floor grew so hot from continuous operation that shift rotations had to occur every 2 hours to prevent heat exhaustion among the manufacturing crews. The logistical chain that delivered these materials to combat zones defied German comprehension of what was possible. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding all German forces in Italy, would later calculate that moving just the materials required for a single American airfield required more shipping capacity than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in the entire Mediterranean theatre. Yet the Americans were building dozens of such fields simultaneously, while maintaining all their regular supply operations for combat units, ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies. The multiplication of capabilities seemed to have no ceiling, no point at which American resources would be exhausted or stretched too thin. Colonel Wilhelm Schmalz commanded a Kampfgruppe that had fought against Allied landings in Sicily. He documented his observations of American engineering operations in a detailed report that survived in Wehrmacht archives and provides remarkable insight into German thinking. On July 13, 1943, his reconnaissance units began observing American engineers starting work on an airfield near the town of Gela. Day 1 saw Americans clearing vegetation with armoured bulldozers that were impervious to sniper fire, working methodically regardless of occasional rifle shots from bypassed German positions. Day 2 saw the ground levelled by machines working through the night in darkness, using lights that German forces would never have dared illuminate for fear of artillery strikes. Day 3 brought steel matting arriving in endless truck convoys that stretched back to the beaches. Day 4 saw the first fighter aircraft landing on completed runways. Schmalz concluded his report with a statement that revealed the depth of German confusion. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was industrial conquest on a scale that rendered traditional military concepts meaningless. The aviation engineers themselves represented a revolution in military thinking that German doctrine had never contemplated or prepared for. By 1943, more than 118,000 American troops were dedicated exclusively to airfield construction. They were organized into specialized battalions, equipped with machinery that seemed fantastical to German observers accustomed to horse-drawn wagons and manual labor. Each battalion possessed equipment worth more than an entire panzer company's complement of tanks. They had D7 bulldozers that could move 20 tons of earth in minutes rather than hours. They had graders that could level a field faster than 100 men working with shovels could hope to accomplish. They had pneumatic drills that could break rock that Wehrmacht pioneers would have been forced to blast with explosives, wasting time and precious demolition materials. Sergeant Klaus Müller served as a Wehrmacht pioneer and was captured in Sicily during the Allied advance. He watched American engineers work with growing amazement and later testified during interrogation that one American operator on a bulldozer accomplished more in an hour than his entire company could achieve working for a week. But it wasn't merely the machines themselves that impressed him, it was the systematic approach that American engineers brought to every task. They had established procedures for everything, timed to the minute with stopwatch precision. While German forces were still conducting initial surveys of a potential construction site, American engineers were already landing aircraft on completed runways. The disparity in tempo and efficiency seemed to come from a completely different understanding of what was possible. The 814th Engineer Aviation Battalion's operational history was captured intact when their headquarters was briefly overrun near Foggia during a German counterattack. The documents revealed the stunning pace of American operations in stark numerical terms. In just 5 weeks of operations in Sicily, they had constructed or repaired 13 separate airfields. They had located and removed 6,000 landmines without suffering a single casualty, using magnetic detection equipment that German pioneers didn't know existed and had never encountered before. They had laid 2.5 million square feet of PSP matting, graded 3.5 million cubic yards of earth, and constructed drainage systems that turned swampy, low-lying areas into all-weather runways capable of operating regardless of rainfall. The scope of work accomplished in such a short time frame defied belief. German intelligence officers initially refused to accept these captured documents as genuine. Colonel Hermann Bolk, who would later command a panzer division in France, reviewed the captured records and declared them obviously fabricated for deception purposes, an elaborate American hoax designed to discourage German resistance. He personally calculated that accomplishing such work would require at least 10,000 labourers working continuously for 6 months under ideal conditions. When his intelligence officers informed him that the American battalion consisted of fewer than 800 men total, he accused them of gross incompetence and threatened disciplinary action for wasting his time with obvious fabrications. The psychological resistance to accepting American capabilities was so strong that even documentary evidence was dismissed as impossible propaganda. The systematic nature of American airfield construction particularly unsettled German observers who prided themselves on methodical planning and execution. The Americans had standardized every aspect of the process to an astonishing degree. Site selection, surveying, clearing, grading, drainage installation, matting deployment, and facilities construction proceeded according to field manuals that reduced complex engineering problems to simple checklists that could be executed by relatively inexperienced personnel with minimal supervision. A captured American technical manual, designated TM-5-255, covering aviation engineering procedures, became required reading for German staff officers at Kesselring's headquarters. They struggled to comprehend its casual assumption that any piece of relatively flat ground, anywhere in the world, could become an operational airfield within 72 hours, regardless of initial conditions. Lieutenant General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin commanded 70 Panzer Corps in Italy and had observation posts overlooking the Rapido River Valley. From his headquarters on the high ground, he watched as Americans built an entire complex of airfields in the valley below, despite German artillery positioned on commanding heights with clear lines of fire to the construction sites. In his memoirs, written years after the war, he described the frustrating experience of watching American engineering operations that seemed unstoppable. His forces could destroy their work each night with accurate artillery fire, cratering runways and demolishing newly erected facilities. Each morning, without fail, the damage was repaired before German pilots finished their breakfast and could mount follow-up air attacks. He concluded that this was not a battle against a military enemy in any traditional sense, but rather a contest against an industrial process that never stopped, never tired, never accepted defeat. The repair capabilities proved even more psychologically disturbing than the initial construction feats. German bombing raids, even when they achieved direct hits and caused significant damage, produced only temporary results that lasted hours instead of days. Luftwaffe technical officers calculated very carefully that a 500-kilogram bomb, creating a crater 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, should close a runway for at least 48 hours, even assuming around-the-clock repair efforts by dedicated crews. American engineers typically had such damage repaired and the runway operational again in 4 to 6 hours from impact to resumed operations. The secret lay not just in superior equipment, though that certainly helped, but in systematic preparation and planning. Aviation engineer battalions carried substantial stockpiles of PSP specifically designated for repairs and kept constantly on hand. They pre-positioned gravel, sand, and rapid-setting cement at strategic points around each airfield perimeter. They maintained bulldozers and graders on 24-hour standby, with crews rotating to ensure immediate response. Most remarkably to German observers, they had standardized repair procedures to such a degree that crews could work in complete darkness, following memorized routines that allowed continuous operations despite German night attacks designed to exploit visibility limitations. Master Sergeant Antonio Benedetti served with the 825th Engineer Aviation Battalion and described the repair process in a letter home that was eventually published in Stars and Stripes newspaper. He wrote that when Jerry dropped his bombs at 11 in the evening, by 11:15 their crews were already rolling out of their tents. Bulldozers pushed debris aside, graders smoothed the crater edges, trucks dumped fill material, compactors levelled it, and they were laying new matting by midnight. By 2 in the morning, the PSP was locked down and painted with identification markings. By dawn, American fighters were taking off over the exact spot where German bombs had hit just hours earlier. He compared it to a choreographed dance where everyone knew their moves by heart, executing complex coordinated actions without need for detailed instructions. The German Air Force, already struggling with chronic fuel shortages and devastating pilot losses that couldn't be replaced, found itself facing an impossible mathematical equation. Every airfield they attacked successfully was operational again before they could organize and mount a follow-up raid to exploit the damage. Meanwhile, new American airfields appeared faster than German intelligence could update their target maps and brief pilots on priority objectives. A Luftwaffe planning document from October 1943 listed 17 Allied airfields in the Foggia complex that pilots might encounter. By the time German pilots received their mission briefings and took off, 24 airfields were fully operational, with 7 more under active construction. The intelligence system simply couldn't keep pace with American construction rates. The specifications of American airfield construction seemed physically impossible to German engineers working with traditional methods and assumptions. A standard fighter strip required 5,000 feet of runway, 150 feet wide, capable of handling aircraft weighing 30,000 pounds, landing at 90 miles per hour without structural failure. German doctrine, based entirely on concrete construction techniques that had been refined over decades, calculated 6 weeks minimum for such a project, even under absolutely ideal conditions, with unlimited resources and no enemy interference. The Americans routinely completed identical facilities in under 72 hours, under active combat conditions, often while under direct enemy observation and regular artillery fire. The disparity wasn't merely in efficiency or work rate, it represented a fundamentally different approach to the entire problem. General Joachim Lemelson commanded panzer troops facing American air power throughout Italy. He wrote in a report to the Supreme Command that the enemy's air superiority was not primarily a question of aircraft numbers or pilot skill, though both were considerable and growing. Rather, it was fundamentally a question of omnipresence that defied conventional military geography. Wherever German forces attempted to concentrate troops for counterattacks or defensive operations, an American airfield appeared within days. German commanders couldn't interdict their construction because Americans built faster than attacks could be organized and executed. The tempo of American engineering operations was simply too rapid for traditional military responses to be effective. The composition of aviation engineer battalions fascinated German intelligence officers who conducted detailed interrogations of captured Americans. These units didn't consist merely of construction workers or laborers, but rather contained highly trained specialists drawn from across American society and civilian industry. Civil engineers from state highway departments, heavy equipment operators from mining companies, concrete specialists from dam projects, drainage experts from the Department of Agriculture. One battalion commander had previously managed construction of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Another had built highways through the Rocky Mountains. This deep well of civilian expertise, coupled with equipment that seemed miraculous to German observers, created capabilities that had no equivalent in Wehrmacht organization. The Caterpillar D7 bulldozer, which served as the backbone of American airfield construction, could exert 20,000 pounds of drawbar pull, casually moving boulders that would have required German engineers to use scarce explosives. The Northwest ATD crane could lift entire prefabricated buildings into position in single operations. The Quickway crane could unload an entire truck of PSP matting in just 3 minutes, work that would have taken German pioneers an hour of manual labour. Major Wilhelm Dürr served as a Luftwaffe base commander before being captured in southern France. He spent weeks as a prisoner studying American airfield operations with the intensity of a graduate student. His post-war analysis, written for United States Air Force Historical Studies, noted that German forces operated from concrete runways built by the Todt organization over months or years of intensive labor, or from grass fields that had been developed gradually over generations. The Americans, by contrast, brought their runways with them like a carpenter brings his tools to a job site. This was not an adaptation German forces could have made even if they had recognized its importance earlier, because it required an entire industrial philosophy that simply did not exist in German military culture. The conceptual gap was too wide to bridge through mere imitation. The rapid construction capability fundamentally altered tactical possibilities in ways German commanders never fully adapted to counter effectively. American commanders could establish forward fighter bases overnight, providing close air support at ranges previously considered impossible for tactical aircraft. They could shift the weight of air power along an extended front in days rather than weeks. Most devastatingly, from a German perspective, they could afford to build airfields they might never actually use, creating strategic uncertainty that forced German commanders to disperse their already limited resources to guard against threats that might not materialize. During Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, American engineers outdid even their own previous achievements, which had already seemed impossible. The 852nd Engineer Aviation Battalion landed with the assault waves on the beaches and had an emergency landing strip operational on the second day after the invasion. By the fourth day, they had 2 fighter squadrons operating from French soil. By the 8th day, they had constructed 3 separate complete airfields, each one capable of handling medium bomber operations. German commanders, whose planning had assumed at least 2 full weeks before facing significant Allied air power operating from French bases, found themselves under continuous air attack from the second day of the invasion forward. General Johannes Blaskowitz commanded German Army Group G in southern France and reported to the Supreme Command that enemy tactical air power seemed to multiply daily through some process he couldn't understand or counter. Each morning brought reconnaissance reports of new airstrips that hadn't existed the previous evening. German movements, which were only possible at night due to Allied air superiority, were restricted to just a few kilometers before dawn revealed formations to enemy fighters operating from fields that literally did not exist when darkness had fallen the night before. The pace of American engineering operations was collapsing German ability to maneuver or concentrate forces. The cultural shock extended far beyond mere technical capabilities and equipment disparities. German military tradition emphasized permanence, solidity, and painstaking preparation. Luftwaffe bases featured concrete runways 2 feet thick, elaborate underground drainage systems, hardened aircraft hangars designed to withstand bombing, and extensive support facilities built to last decades. These installations, representing millions of man-hours and Reichsmarks, were considered strategic assets to be carefully defended and maintained. The American approach, which was deliberately temporary, completely flexible, and almost disposable by design, represented a conceptual revolution that German thinking simply could not accommodate or respond to. Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, the famous Stuka pilot with hundreds of combat missions, observed American operations firsthand while briefly stationed in Italy before the German withdrawal northward. He later wrote that German forces had spent 2 years building their base at Foggia, creating what they considered a first-class permanent military installation. The Americans rebuilt it completely in 2 weeks after German engineers had destroyed everything before retreating. But they didn't rebuild it the way Germans would have approached the task, with permanence, solidity, and traditional methods. Instead, they laid steel strips that could be pulled up and moved tomorrow if tactical requirements changed. They erected tent hangars that could disappear in hours. They created military capability without long-term commitment. He described it as warfare without weight, fighting without the burden of permanence. The psychological impact on German troops proved as militarily significant as the tactical advantages Americans gained. Soldiers huddled in foxholes watched American fighters operate from runways built on ground where they had fought desperate battles just days earlier. Tank crews saw their carefully camouflaged positions revealed by reconnaissance aircraft operating from strips that hadn't existed when they had first dug in. Artillery observers found their targets suddenly defended by fighters scrambled from fields built overnight. Private Johann Schmidt, whose letters home were carefully preserved by his family after his death, wrote in November 1943 that Americans were not fighting a war in any sense he understood. Instead, they were building a civilization as they advanced. Wherever they moved forward, airports appeared almost magically. Roads were paved to permanent standards, telephone lines were strung, German forces destroyed infrastructure. Americans built it faster than it could be destroyed. Germans retreated from positions they had held for months. Americans built complete airfields in places Germans had held yesterday. He asked his wife how Germany could possibly defeat an enemy who literally carried his own geography with him wherever he went. The innovation extended well beyond the basic PSP matting that formed runways. American engineers had developed specialized equipment for every conceivable environmental challenge they might encounter. The Rome plow, a massive blade specifically designed for clearing heavy vegetation, could remove trees 18 inches in diameter while moving forward at 5 miles per hour, clearing land faster than hundreds of men with axes and saws. Specialized drilling equipment could create drainage wells through solid rock without explosives. Portable rock crushers could convert rubble from bombed buildings into suitable base material for runway construction. Chemical soil stabilizers could transform loose sand into surfaces capable of supporting heavy bombers weighing tens of thousands of pounds. The Wehrmacht's engineers, many of them highly skilled professionals with university degrees before the war, found themselves reduced to manual labor while watching American teenagers barely out of high school casually operate machinery that transformed entire landscapes in hours. A captured report from the 19th Luftwaffe Field Division noted with evident bewilderment that American soldiers who appeared no older than 18 years of age casually operated individual pieces of equipment worth more than entire German engineering companies possessed in total. The division's engineering officer calculated equipment values in Reichsmarks and concluded that American engineering battalions were better equipped than German panzer divisions. The prefabrication revolution particularly stunned German observers who came from a tradition of building everything on site from raw materials. Entire airfield facilities arrived in numbered wooden crates, ready for assembly like gigantic construction toys with illustrated instruction sheets. Control towers 40 feet tall were erected in 8 hours by relatively unskilled labor following simple directions. Hangars covering 15,000 square feet were operational in 2 days. Fuel systems with underground storage tanks and miles of piping were installed and functional in 72 hours. Operations centers, complete with communications equipment and meteorological instruments, were functioning within 24 hours of the crates being unloaded from trucks. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Zimmermann served as a Luftwaffe logistics officer and had extensive pre-war experience in construction management. He calculated very precisely that establishing equivalent facilities using German methods and materials would require 2,000 tons of concrete, 500 tons of steel reinforcement bars, 50,000 man-hours of skilled labor, and an absolute minimum of 8 weeks under perfect conditions with ideal weather. He watched Americans achieve superior functional results with 100 tons of prefabricated materials, 50 men, and 72 hours of work in less than ideal conditions. The disparity wasn't a matter of degree, but of kind, representing completely different approaches to military engineering. The supply chain supporting this construction miracle defied German comprehension of what was logistically possible. Each aviation engineer battalion required 2,000 tons of equipment and supplies to establish a single fighter field suitable for squadron operations. A bomber base capable of handling heavy aircraft required 5,000 tons of materials. Yet American Liberty ships, themselves products of revolutionary mass production methods, delivered these materials directly to invasion beaches. Specialized landing craft designed specifically for PSP transportation brought steel matting ashore even under fire. Within hours of materials hitting the beach, steel matting was moving inland on trucks built in Detroit, using gasoline refined in Texas, following maps printed in Washington. The integration of American industrial capacity into battlefield operations was seamless and continuous. General Gustav von Sangen commanded the 15th German Army facing American forces in Holland and described watching American transport aircraft landing on a runway that his troops had defended just 48 hours earlier. His operations officer insisted the grid reference coordinates must be wrong because there was no airfield at that location according to their intelligence maps. Von Sangen had to show him through field glasses that Americans had built a complete functional airfield while German staffs were still writing situation reports about holding the position. The pace of American operations consistently exceeded German ability to process and respond to information. The strategic implications gradually became clear to German commanders, though far too late to develop any effective countermeasures. American ability to project air power anywhere instantly meant that traditional concepts of front lines and rear areas became completely meaningless. Every German position, no matter how distant from established Allied bases, was potentially under immediate air threat. Reserve formations couldn't concentrate for counterattacks without inviting devastating attacks from fighters operating from runways that hadn't existed when movement orders were first issued. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, issued a directive in May 1944 that revealed Wehrmacht, desperation and confusion. Enemy airfield construction capabilities must be assumed to be unlimited, the directive stated. All operational planning must assume Allied tactical air support will be available within 72 hours of any amphibious landing or breakthrough operation. Traditional calculations based on distance from established enemy air bases are no longer valid or useful for defensive planning. The directive proved prophetic in the extreme. After the Normandy landings, American engineers performed even more spectacular feats than they had achieved in the Mediterranean. Advanced landing grounds sprouted across the Norman countryside like mushrooms after rain, appearing overnight in fields that had been empty the previous evening. Advanced Landing Ground 1, near the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, was operational on the 4th day after invasion. By the 11th day, 9 complete American airfields were operational in Normandy. By the 31st day, there were 24 separate facilities. German units, already reeling from the initial invasion shock, found themselves under constant attack from aircraft based so close to the front lines that pilots could make 4 or 5 sorties daily, returning to rearm and refuel in just minutes rather than hours. The intensity and persistence of air attacks left German formations unable to move or concentrate during daylight hours. Captain Hermann Buchner served as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer tasked with compiling comprehensive reports on American engineering capabilities for higher headquarters. His post-war analysis, which survived in American historical archives, stated bluntly that German forces were not defeated by American courage, though Americans certainly displayed courage in combat. They were not defeated by American weapons, though American weapons were generally excellent. German forces were defeated by American engineers who made geography itself irrelevant to military operations. They built their victory methodically, runway by runway, across Europe and ultimately into Germany itself. The war was lost not in dramatic battles, but in the accumulated weight of American engineering superiority that made German tactical excellence increasingly meaningless. The pinnacle of American airfield construction efficiency came during the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945. The 834th Engineer Aviation Battalion crossed the Rhine at Remagen immediately after the bridge was secured and had an emergency landing strip operational on the eastern bank by the end of the second day. By day 3, they were landing transport aircraft, carrying supplies and reinforcements directly to the bridgehead, bypassing the overloaded bridge entirely. German commanders, whose defensive planning had assumed several days before Allied air power could effectively support a Rhine crossing, found their carefully prepared positions untenable within hours. The tempo of American operations consistently exceeded German assumptions and planning parameters. Major General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the elite Panzer Lehr Division and reported to his superiors that Americans brought their air force with them like mobile artillery. Where American forces arrived in the morning, their aircraft were operating by evening. German forces could not move in daylight, could not concentrate for counterattacks, could not effectively resist. The Americans, he concluded, had industrialized warfare beyond German comprehension or ability to counter. The numbers told a story that no amount of German courage or tactical brilliance could overcome. By war's end, American aviation engineer battalions had constructed or reconstructed over 1,000 airfields across Europe and the Pacific theaters. They had laid over 300 million square feet of PSP matting, enough material to build a continuous runway stretching from Berlin to Moscow. They had moved 500 million cubic yards of earth, graded 50 million square yards of surface, and installed 1,000 miles of drainage pipe. They had accomplished in months what German military engineers calculated would require decades of sustained effort under peacetime conditions. The scope of engineering achievement was unprecedented in military history. Werner Kreiper served as Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe and made his final assessment while in American captivity after Germany's surrender. His words captured the totality of German miscalculation and misunderstanding. German forces, he explained, had planned for a war of armies and battles, of individual courage and willingness to sacrifice. The Americans instead fought a war of production and engineering, of industrial efficiency and logistical superiority. Germans believed warfare was fundamentally an art requiring genius and inspiration. Americans proved it was fundamentally an industry requiring organization and resources. Every destroyed American aircraft was replaced tomorrow from factories that never stopped producing. Every cratered runway was operational by dawn thanks to engineering battalions that never stopped working. German forces could destroy what existed, but Americans could create what didn't exist. And creation, Kreiper concluded, proved more powerful than destruction in determining war's outcome. Wehrmacht officers interviewed decades after the war ended consistently cited American engineering capabilities as the most psychologically devastating aspect of fighting against the Western Allies. Unlike combat itself, which German military tradition had thoroughly prepared them for over centuries, the industrial transformation of warfare left them conceptually defenseless and unable to adapt. They could understand and accept being outfought by better tactics or greater courage. They couldn't comprehend or accept being outbuilt by superior engineering and production capacity. One soldier explained the fundamental difference between Eastern and Western fronts. Against the Russians, Germans fought traditional battles. Against the Americans, Germans fought against factories that never slept. When German forces destroyed a Russian position, it stayed destroyed until the Soviets could bring up reserve formations. When Germans destroyed an American position, it was rebuilt before they could reload their artillery pieces. Russians had courage and numbers that German soldiers could respect and understand. Americans had bulldozers and steel matting that rendered courage increasingly irrelevant. The soldier admitted he feared the bulldozers more than he feared Russian tanks. The portable airfield technology reached its ultimate expression in Operation Varsity, the massive airborne crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. American engineers actually jumped with the paratroopers, carrying lightweight aluminum planking designed specifically for rapid runway construction in airborne operations, where every pound of weight mattered. Within 6 hours of landing behind enemy lines, they had established landing zones for gliders carrying additional heavy equipment. Within 12 hours of the initial jump, they had an operational airstrip capable of evacuating wounded soldiers and bringing in supply aircraft with ammunition and rations. German commanders, observing this development, realized that American forces had achieved the ultimate military flexibility. They could establish air superiority anywhere in the world, instantly, regardless of terrain obstacles or enemy opposition. General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, Germany's most experienced paratrooper commander with extensive combat experience, watched American airborne engineers work and later admitted in captivity that Germans had invented modern airborne warfare in the Netherlands and Crete. But Americans had perfected it by adding engineering capability. Germans could seize tactical objectives through surprise and courage. Americans could build permanent bases to hold what they captured. Germans could capture existing airfields. Americans could create new airfields anywhere they chose. They had industrialized even the most elite and specialized form of warfare, removing the limitations that made German airborne operations risky gambles. The contrast with German construction methods became increasingly stark and embarrassing as the war progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. The Luftwaffe's own construction units, the Luftwaffe Bautruppen, operated with methods and techniques essentially unchanged since the previous World War. They relied heavily on manual labor, often using forced workers and prisoners of war who had little motivation to work efficiently. A typical German airfield construction project in 1944 might employ 5,000 workers laboring for 3 months to achieve results that an American aviation engineer battalion could accomplish with 800 men in 3 days. The disparity in productivity wasn't explained by individual worker laziness or incompetence, but by completely different organizational approaches and equipment availability. General Walter Grabmann commanded 3rd Fighter Division and described inspecting a captured American airfield in France after German forces were pushed back. Everything was deliberately temporary in construction, yet completely functional in operation. The control tower was prefabricated wood that could be dismantled in hours if necessary, yet it contained better radio equipment and meteorological instruments than permanent German installations built of concrete and steel. The hangars were canvas and steel tubes, looking more like circus tents than military buildings, yet they protected aircraft better than German concrete structures because damaged sections could be quickly repaired or entirely replaced. He called it the architecture of victory, substance without permanence, capability without long-term commitment. The cultural implications extended well beyond purely military considerations into fundamental questions about how societies organize themselves. German military tradition valued permanence above almost everything else, building monuments to engineering skill that would last for generations as testaments to German thoroughness. The Luftwaffe's pre-war airfields were architectural statements featuring Art Deco terminal buildings and monumentalist hangars that proclaimed German power and sophistication. American airfields were purely functional, designed to last exactly as long as tactically needed, and not one day more. This philosophical difference reflected deeper disparities in how the two nations approached warfare itself. Professor Heinrich Fokker, designer of the Fokker-Wulf aircraft that equipped much of the Luftwaffe, visited American-constructed airfields after his capture and wrote an analysis comparing approaches. German engineering seeks perfection, he noted, the ideal solution that will stand forever as a monument to craftsmanship. American engineering seeks adequacy, the quickest solution that will work today and can be improved tomorrow. In peacetime conditions, the German approach might well be superior, producing works of lasting value. In warfare, American methods proved overwhelming because adequacy achieved quickly trumps perfection achieved slowly. The war was over before German perfection could be realized. The repair capabilities proved as strategically decisive as initial construction speed. During the Battle of the Bulge, German commanders counted heavily on winter weather to ground Allied aircraft and allow their offensive to proceed without constant air attacks. The Führer's plan assumed that snow and ice would neutralize American air superiority for weeks, giving German armor time to reach critical objectives. They hadn't calculated that American engineers could clear snow from PSP runways in minutes using specialized equipment, while German concrete runways remained unusable for days because ice bonded to concrete and had to be chipped away manually. The ability to maintain flight operations in weather that kept the Luftwaffe grounded provided a decisive advantage that helped defeat the offensive. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound and demoralizing. Unlike attacking permanent installations where cumulative damage could be observed and measured over time, attacks on American fields seemed completely pointless. Young Luftwaffe pilots, already facing overwhelming numerical odds that made survival unlikely, lost motivation for missions that achieved nothing lasting even when successful. Combat veterans reported that squadron morale collapsed when intelligence briefings showed that targeted airfields were operational within hours of attacks that pilots had risked their lives to accomplish. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer flew one of Germany's last hopes, the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter that could outrun any Allied aircraft. He described his experience in bitter terms. German jets gave them a speed advantage that should have been tactically decisive against slower Allied fighters. But speed meant nothing when Americans had airfields distributed everywhere across the landscape. German pilots could outrun Allied fighters in direct combat, but couldn't outrun American geography. Every emergency landing field that German jets might use had been destroyed or captured. Every field Americans needed appeared overnight. The psychological burden was crushing. The production statistics behind American airfield construction capacity defied German comprehension even after the war when full figures became available. The United States produced enough PSP matting to cover 200 square miles of ground, using steel that Germany desperately needed for tanks and submarines and artillery pieces. The manufacturing process required precise engineering and quality control that German factories, operating under constant strategic bombing and severe resource constraints, could never have maintained even if they had recognized the need. Yet Americans produced PSP matting alongside record quantities of aircraft, ships, vehicles, weapons, and every other implement of modern warfare. The industrial capacity seemed limitless. Albert Speer, who served as armaments minister and was responsible for German war production, studied captured American production figures during the Second World War and concluded they had to be propaganda exaggerations, impossible numbers designed to discourage German resistance. When post-war analysis confirmed their complete accuracy, he admitted that Germans could not conceive of such industrial capacity because it exceeded not just their means, but their very imagination of what was possible. Americans, he concluded, were not just fighting a different war with different methods. They were fighting in a different century with capabilities that wouldn't have seemed out of place in science fiction. The legacy of American airfield engineering haunted German military professionals for decades after surrender. In NATO planning sessions during the 1950s, when former Wehrmacht officers worked alongside their former enemies, German participants would interrupt tactical discussions to ask detailed questions about airfield construction capacity. They remained traumatized by their experience of American engineering overwhelming traditional military calculations. General Franz Halder, who had served as chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his memoirs that German forces had prepared meticulously for every possible contingency except one. They never imagined the enemy would simply build his way to victory, treating military operations like a massive construction project. Americans treated Europe like an enormous construction site, and they possessed the industrial tools to reshape it according to their tactical needs. Germany's finest tactical minds, trained in centuries of European military tradition, were ultimately defeated not by superior strategy or fighting, but by American bulldozers and prefabricated building materials. The transformation of warfare that American aviation engineers represented went beyond mere technical capability or equipment superiority. They embodied a completely different approach to military problems, treating traditional constraints and limitations as engineering challenges to be solved through industrial innovation rather than accepted as permanent features of warfare. Mountains, rivers, swamps, and distances that had shaped European military operations for millennia became minor inconveniences to be bulldozed, bridged, drained, or simply ignored. Natural obstacles that had channeled armies and determined battle outcomes throughout history were rendered irrelevant by American engineering capabilities. Field Marshal Kesselring, reflecting on the Italian campaign while in Allied captivity, made perhaps the most eloquent summary of German bewilderment and confusion. German forces, he noted, were the inheritors of Clausewitz and Moltke, acknowledged masters of operational art and students of 2,000 years of European military history. They knew how to fight effectively in every type of terrain, under every possible condition, against every conceivable enemy. But Americans did not fight terrain according to any principles Germans understood. Instead, they transformed terrain to suit their operational needs. They did not accept environmental conditions as given. They created new conditions through engineering. They did not defeat German forces in traditional battle where German advantages in training and experience might have mattered. Instead, they built their victory methodically, piece by piece, runway by runway, until German expertise became irrelevant and German experience became worthless. Traditional military skill meant nothing when the enemy redefined the battlefield itself through industrial engineering. The final humiliation came during the occupation period, when German officers were required to attend American engineering demonstrations as part of their re-education. They watched aviation engineer battalions construct complete airfields in exercises, accomplishing in hours what German doctrine stated categorically required weeks of intensive effort. Veterans reported leaving these demonstrations in tears, finally understanding the totality of their miscalculation and the impossibility of the task they had faced. Colonel Joachim Müncheberg, a fighter pilot with 135 confirmed victories and one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces, attended one such demonstration in 1946. He wrote to his wife afterward that watching American engineers build in 4 hours what Germans could not build in 4 weeks finally made him understand why Germany lost. Germans had brought warriors to what was fundamentally an industrial competition. They thought courage and tactical skill would triumph over material superiority. They didn't comprehend that Americans would make material superiority so completely overwhelming that German courage became irrelevant to the outcome. The numbers provided a stark epilogue to German military pride and centuries of European military tradition. American aviation engineers constructed 235 major airfields in Europe alone, not even counting hundreds of emergency strips and temporary facilities that were used briefly and then abandoned. They laid enough PSP matting to build a continuous highway stretching from London to Istanbul. They moved enough earth to fill a canal connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They achieved construction rates that German engineers, even using slave labour and unlimited manpower, never approached under any conditions. In the Pacific Theatre, the statistics were even more staggering and impressive. Engineers transformed coral atolls into major air bases capable of supporting heavy bomber operations. They built functional runways through jungle terrain that German observers had personally assessed and dismissed as completely unusable. They created elaborate facilities on tiny islands that German strategists had evaluated as having no military value whatsoever. The apex of American engineering achievement came at Tinian, where engineers built what was briefly the world's largest airfield complex in 1944. 6 parallel runways, each over 8,000 feet long, were constructed on an island where Japanese forces had maintained only a single short grass strip. From these runways, B-29 bombers would eventually launch the atomic attacks that ended the war without the need for invasion. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruger, Germany's most senior naval engineer with decades of experience in major construction projects, studied American construction methods extensively during his post-war internment. His conclusion was stark and unambiguous. German military planning measured power in traditional terms, counting divisions, ships, and aircraft as the metrics of military strength. Americans measured military power in tons of concrete poured, miles of runway laid, and cubic yards of earth moved per day. Germans were correct that modern industrial war would ultimately be won by industrial power rather than traditional military virtues. They simply never imagined that industrial power could be projected directly onto the battlefield itself, that factories and construction equipment could serve as weapons as surely as cannons and tanks. The conceptual gap was unbridgeable because it required abandoning centuries of European military thinking. The revolution in military engineering that American aviation engineers represented fundamentally changed warfare forever. The ability to create air superiority anywhere on demand, instantly, through engineering capability rather than aerial combat, rendered traditional military geography completely obsolete. Distance from established bases, terrain obstacles, and seasonal weather conditions, factors that had governed military operations throughout all of human history, became minor variables in American operational planning rather than determining constraints. German forces planned operations around these limitations. Americans engineered solutions that eliminated the limitations entirely. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured warfare doctrine and the man most responsible for blitzkrieg tactics, made a final assessment that captured the existential shock to German military thinking. Germans had perfected mobile warfare, he acknowledged, creating the blitzkrieg doctrine that conquered most of Europe in a matter of months. But Americans had achieved something far greater and more revolutionary. They achieved mobile infrastructure, moving not just armies quickly, but entire industrial civilization. They brought their complete industrial base directly to the battlefield, assembled it under enemy fire, and operated it during active combat. German forces were still fighting the previous war using refined versions of traditional methods. Americans were simultaneously inventing the next war using completely new approaches. The gap was too wide to bridge through adaptation or learning. The story of German encounters with American airfield construction capabilities is ultimately a narrative of conceptual defeat rather than merely material defeat. The Wehrmacht, proud inheritor of centuries of European military tradition and victories, found itself facing an opponent who had transcended that entire tradition completely. American aviation engineers didn't defeat German military art through superior tactics or strategy. They made German military art completely irrelevant to modern warfare. They proved conclusively that in industrialized total war, the ability to build was more militarily powerful than the ability to destroy, that creation could overwhelm destruction, that systematic engineering could triumph over tactical brilliance. Paul Hauser, an SS general who was one of Germany's most decorated commanders with an outstanding combat record, provided perhaps the most poignant epitaph for German military presumptions during a conversation with American interrogators after surrender. Americans kept saying throughout the war that they would win because they could outproduce Germany industrially, he recalled. German commanders laughed at this claim, assuming Americans meant more tanks and more planes rolling off assembly lines. Germans didn't understand Americans meant they would manufacture the battlefield itself, that they would produce the very ground that wars were fought on. Americans didn't defeat the Wehrmacht in traditional military terms, he concluded. They bypassed German forces entirely, building their victory on runways that didn't exist when individual battles started. It was a form of warfare Germans had never conceived of and had no doctrine to counter. The German generals who had studied Napoleon's campaigns meticulously, who could quote Clausewitz from memory and debate Schlieffen's principles, who understood every aspect of European military history, found themselves completely undone by American teenagers barely out of high school operating bulldozers and laying steel planks according to simple instruction manuals. They had prepared thoroughly for every traditional form of warfare. They had trained for every type of combat environment. They had studied every historical campaign. But they encountered industrial construction at battlefield pace, engineering capability used as a weapon system, and building as a fundamental form of combat superiority. Nothing in centuries of German military education had prepared them for this revolutionary approach. In the final analysis, German military professionals were left confronting a truth too bitter and humiliating to fully accept or acknowledge. They had not been outfought by better soldiers or superior tactics. They had been outbuilt by an industrial system that transformed military operations into construction projects. The finest army Europe had produced, perhaps the finest in all of military history, had been systematically defeated not by courage or superior strategy or tactical brilliance, but by an enemy who could transform wheat fields into major air bases overnight, who could repair bomb damage in hours that should have taken days, who fought not with courage alone, but with steel matting and bulldozers and prefabricated buildings. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signing Germany's unconditional surrender as the most senior German military officer, reportedly told General Eisenhower that German forces knew they would eventually face American industrial might. What they had never anticipated was facing that industry directly on the battlefield itself, in the tangible form of engineers who could build faster than German forces could destroy. Eisenhower's reply, if the anecdote is accurate, captured the essence of American victory in a single sentence. That's precisely why Germany lost this war. The legacy of this transformation endures in military doctrine worldwide to the present day. Modern warfare universally assumes rapid airfield construction, forward base development, and expeditionary engineering as fundamental military capabilities that every competent force must possess. The revolution that shocked and bewildered German generals in 1943 has become so routine and commonplace that modern military officers cannot imagine conducting warfare without these capabilities. Yet for Wehrmacht officers who first witnessed American engineers casually unrolling runways from trucks like carpets, it was the precise moment their world ended forever and a completely new age of industrial warfare began. They had expected to fight American soldiers in traditional combat. They never expected Americans would abolish the battlefield itself as a fixed entity, replacing it with an industrial landscape that appeared and disappeared according to immediate tactical needs. They never imagined their enemy's greatest weapon would not be any tank or plane or gun, but rather the capability to transform any piece of ground anywhere into a functional airbase instantly, repeatedly, and unstoppably. The German generals could never have imagined that American engineers would routinely unroll airstrips from trucks overnight like they were laying down rugs. But they did exactly that, and German forces were utterly unprepared. That single miscalculation, more than any particular battle or campaign outcome, explains why the Wehrmacht, acknowledged master of continental European warfare, found itself helpless before an enemy who had successfully industrialized victory itself. German forces brought a traditional military force to what turned out to be an engineering competition, and they lost comprehensively before they even understood the true nature of the contest they had entered.